There's one massive mistake people make when they think about China's economy. The average person sees China's economy as one of the most dominant in the world, and most people believe the only way this economy might crash will be war or a massive economic standoff with a global power like the USA. But it turns out China's looming economic crash has less to do with external factors. Because the biggest threat to China's economy is actually coming from inside China. It's the reality that its population of over 1 billion people is shrinking very fast. In 2022, China recorded its first population decline in over 60 years, with the population dropping by around 850,000 people. 1 year later, the population had shrunk by another 2 million people, and in the middle of 2023, India overtook China as the world's most populous country. But that's not even the worst part. Demographic projections suggest that even though this may be the beginning of China's population decline, this is nowhere close to the end.
Many say this is a population time bomb, that it is ushering in a period of decline, and this is likely to be a trend, and these numbers dropping are likely to continue.
Research suggests China's population could fall below 1 billion people before the end of this century. Now, if you're thinking that's still so many decades away, well, consider this. The ripple effects are already being felt, and they're shaking the foundations of the world's second largest economy in 3 main ways, and the third one might be the worst. The first is a shrinking labor force. One of the most immediate ways this population collapse is impacting China's economy is through its labor force. For decades, China's massive population was the backbone of its entire economy. It's the thing that has powered its manufacturing industry, the thing that has turned China literally into the factory of the world. But with fewer young people entering the labor force each year, it means that this engine, China's ultimate cheat code, is starting to slow down. So let's talk numbers. Between 2010 and 2020, China's working age population shrank by around 40 million people. And projections show we could actually decline by an additional 23% by 2050. So what does this mean for China? Well, it means labor shortages, with factories struggling to keep up with demand, and wages rising as companies compete for a smaller pool of workers. Now, China's big advantage over the years was its ability to produce things at low cost. But if China can no longer produce goods as cheaply due to skyrocketing wages, then it risks losing its dominance in manufacturing to countries like Vietnam or India, which are already stepping up as alternative production hubs. The second huge economic impact is an aging population. A shrinking labor force means that China has to make up the difference somewhere, right? And with fewer and fewer births, China is looking for an answer in its elderly. In 2024, China approved a law to increase retirement age, essentially making sure that older people work and contribute to the economy for longer. Before the new law, Chinese workers could retire as early as 50 for women and 60 for men, which were some of the lowest retirement ages in the world. But with fewer young people to replace retiring workers, the government is introducing reforms to raise retirement age to 63 for men and to 55 for women. Now, this might sound like a logical fix, but it's a deeply unpopular move. Imagine being told that after decades of grueling work, you have to stick it out for a few more years before you start to enjoy your retirement and your golden years. Many older workers, particularly those in physically demanding jobs, are pushing back against this move, arguing, of course, that the new rules are out of touch with the realities of their lives. But for the government, this change is necessary to keep the pension system afloat and to also reduce the dependency ratio, which is the number of retirees supported by each working age person, which, by the way, is rapidly rising in China as the population ages with fewer people being born. Now, the third impact on China's economy is the real estate crisis. For decades, as China's economy exploded, property development was a cornerstone of China's economic growth. This was driven by two things: rapid urbanization and rising demand for housing. But with the population shrinking and fewer young families forming, demand for new housing is slowly but surely drying up. And the effects of this are devastating. So get this. China's property market accounts for roughly 25% of its GDP, but that property market is in a huge crisis. The value of homes are crashing and home sales are falling off a cliff at the same time. And if that wasn't bad enough, the biggest property developers in China are defaulting on their debts. Take Evergrande, one of the biggest and most important companies in China, which was in debt to the tune of 300 billion and filed for bankruptcy in 2023. And so with property values and prices in many regions crashing, investors like Evergrande faced a major crunch with excess inventory of unsold property and no cash to build pre-sold properties. For context, in May 2024, Bloomberg reported that China had the equivalent of 60 million unsold apartments, which could take up to 4 years to sell. So the big question, why is all of this happening? How did China, a country that once worried about being overpopulated, find itself in this new reality of a population collapse? A big part of the story lies in its declining birth rate. For decades, China's one-child policy, which was introduced in 1980, limited families to a single child in an effort to control population growth. And while that policy successfully slowed down population expansion in the 1970s and 80s, it also set the stage for today's crisis. Families, especially those in urban areas, have essentially grown accustomed to having fewer children. And so China went from having way too many babies being born to not having enough. Now, even though this policy was relaxed in 2015 and eventually abolished in 2021, the reality is that China still faces the cultural barriers to having more babies and, of course, larger families. Because when you tell generation after generation that it can only have one child, it's hard to tell them all of a sudden to have a lot more babies. But here's the thing though, the cultural barrier is not the only problem. China's economic problems mean that it's expensive to have and raise children in modern China, with the cost of education, the cost of housing, and the cost of childcare all essentially being major deterrents for millions of young people. So the result of this is that China's birth rate has slowly declined and has now surpassed its death rate. The birth rate is around 1.2 births per woman, which of course is far below the replacement level of 2.1 births per woman, which is needed to sustain and replace the population. Going from having too many babies to having too few has big implications for China's future. Looking ahead, the projections for China's population collapse are actually sobering. By 2050, it's estimated that over 39% of the population will be aged 60 or older, and that number will increase to 52% by 2100, which, if you've been paying attention, means that there'll be fewer workers and fewer consumers, because a shrinking population doesn't just mean hands to build the economy. It also means fewer people to spend money, to innovate, and to drive growth. So it's clear what this might mean for China. But what does it mean for the rest of the world? Well, China's economy is deeply intertwined with the global market. So if China's manufacturing sector slows down, then global supply chains could be disrupted, driving up prices of goods all across the world. And if China's property market remains unstable, even that can have ripple effects on global financial markets. And of course, if China's economic growth slows down significantly, well, that's also bad news for the global economy as well. So essentially, what happens in China in this case will not stay in China. This will be a global issue. As China navigates this turning point in its history, one thing is clear: the world will be watching. And the lessons learned here could easily shape the futures of economies everywhere else. And if you want to see how one of Asia's richest countries is also facing a population collapse problem, then you should watch this video next about Singapore. See you in the next one.